Welcome back to Climate Capital and Tourism in the Americas. We're now going to be going into our second panel of the conference. Unfortunately, there has been a slight change from the schedule. Our third presenter, Jaime Landines Aceros, unfortunately isn't able to join us because he's got COVID. So we're just going to have two presentations in this panel. And I will hand over to Jordana Dim, who's kindly offered to chair for us this afternoon. So Jordana, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thank you all for a really fantastic set of talks and discussions. Much food for thought for those of us who think about travel, tourism, and the environment. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce two speakers today who, in fact, have some intriguingly similar and complementary concepts going on. I think our first speaker is Caribbean. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, Caribbean. Vamos a ver. Olivier Lozano Villanueva, un investigador independiente y gestor cultural que tiene su licencia en humanidades en el área de filosofía con la Universidad de Quintana Roo y quien se dedica al desarrollo de proyectos orientados a contribuir a la sensibilización de una cultura crítica mediante creación de redes de trabajo con académicos, colectividades y universidades. Entonces, le doy la palabra a nuestro primer interveniente. Bienvenido, welcome.
Hola, buen día, buenas tardes, buenas noches, dependiendo cuando escuchen esto. De entrada, pues agradezco a todo el comité por haber aceptado la propuesta para poder dialogar el día de hoy. Y bueno, la propuesta para hoy se llama Caribe Alien, lo podemos pronunciar así. Así puede quedar, ¿no? Es como que es un concepto que realmente he estado trabajando desde hace un par de años y que pues es preciso ubicarles en que está trabajando en él y que justo tiene como objetivo poder pensar ahí ciertas nociones sobre el Caribe. No sé si estoy hablando muy rápido o algo así, si tiendo luego a hablar un poco rápido. Si es así, porfa, con toda confianza me pueden decir para que disminuya un poco la velocidad, ¿no? Entonces, voy a ir compartiendo pantalla. Listo, ahí se ve, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Bueno, como les decía, el concepto y el esfuerzo que hay detrás de esto nace necesariamente a través de poder pensar, de poder resignificar, ¿no?, los procesos sociales, políticos que se están dando en la península de Yucatán, particularmente en el estado de Quintana Roo, ¿no? A raíz de eso quiero que podamos como que poder ubicarnos, que esta propuesta está situada justamente en esta condición geográfica, pero que dialoga con varias tradiciones de pensamiento, ¿no? Particularmente, como a manera de introducción, lo primero es ubicarnos desde dónde y con quiénes estamos tratando de pensar, y para ello es necesario, pues, ubicarnos en el Caribe, ¿no? Entendiendo el Caribe como este conjunto cultural, como este conjunto de diversos pueblos, de diversas comunidades que habitan en la región insular, en algunas partes del Pacífico, la región continental, y particularmente en México, que también tiene su influencia en el sur de la península de Yucatán a través de Quintana Roo, con la entrada de Belice, pero también en otras dinámicas como es a través de las costas, ¿no?, particularmente en Veracruz. Pero nosotros tomamos como punto de referencia esta singularidad del Caribe mexicano, tomando a Quintana Roo como el lugar desde donde vamos a pensar si es posible problematizar sobre una caribeñidad, ¿no? Nada más, perdón un momentito. Aquí son un par de fotos de la península para que podamos como que adentrarnos, ¿no?, a la problemática, o más que a la problemática, a la singularidad que tiene esta región. Si nosotros podemos ver del lado derecho, pues tenemos el Mar Caribe, todo lo que ustedes pueden percibir son las costas de Quintana Roo, sobre todo han de ser muy conocidas por Cancún, Playa del Carmen, más reciente Tulum, ¿no?, Cozumel también, Holbox al norte en otra medida, pero pues es lo que se conoce y lo que comúnmente se asocia con el Caribe mexicano y en este caso el Caribe en Quintana Roo, ¿no? Sin embargo, me parece importante ubicar dónde está el esfuerzo intelectual de esta categoría, ¿no? Caribe Alien. Dice Kamau Brathwaite en Historia de la Voz, en lo que respecta a lo que escribimos, a nuestros modelos perceptuales, somos más conscientes, en términos de sensibilidad, de la caída de la nieve. Por ejemplo, los modelos están todos allí para ver la caída de la nieve, que de la fuerza del huracán. En pocas palabras, no tenemos las sílabas, la inteligencia silábica para describir el huracán, que es propiamente nuestra propia experiencia, mientras que podemos describir la experiencia ajena importada de la caída de la nieve. Bueno, en contexto con este escrito, bueno, Kamau pensaba necesariamente cómo los niños en Barbados, Jamaica, la región insular, tenían mucho más facilidad para expresar estéticamente todos los fenómenos de la naturaleza exportados de la narrativa pedagógica de Europa, ¿no? El hecho de la caída de la nieve no es una casualidad, ¿no?, sino que necesariamente nos ubica en pensar cuál es la precisión para poder describir la caída de la nieve en una región como el Caribe, donde la constante es el huracán, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, la propuesta y la inquietud ahí es poder acercarnos a qué podríamos estar entendiendo como modelos perceptuales, ¿no?, que en este sentido me parece podemos comenzar a utilizarlo como justo un conjunto de categorías que nos puedan permitir visibilizar, describir o acercarnos a nombrar eventos y cotidianidades desde otro universo de sentido mucho más afín a las experiencias. Nada más, me permite, está pasando el gas, espero que no se escuche tanto. Bueno, aquí viene un poco lo que empieza a crear un sentido, una tensión, ¿no? El Caribe mexicano entendido como una singularidad, en tanto la noción de este Caribe se va a fortalecer y se va a consolidar con el desarrollo del estado quintanarroense y con el desarrollo del polo de desarrollo turístico de Cancún. Esto no es casualidad, ¿no? Para que pudiese desarrollarse Quintana Roo como estado, igual precisar una breve remembranza conceptual e histórica, hasta antes de 1960, 1970, Quintana Roo formaba parte de México, pero era un territorio, ¿no? En tanto era un territorio, no era un estado de la federación. Para poder consolidarse justamente como un estado de la federación, era necesario, pues, encontrar ciertas características que le pudieran dar esa cohesión. Pues muy importante también, estamos hablando de que hay por lo menos 50 años después de la Revolución Mexicana y que en ese sentido se van a tomar ciertas decisiones para poder concretar este desarrollo, ¿no? Una de las pensadoras y que me parece ha hecho trabajos más importantes sobre esta noción de el Caribe como una creación propia del Estado mexicano es Elizabeth Bunyan, ¿no?, quien en este texto, Administrar a los extranjeros, justamente ahonda en pensar lo siguiente, dice: El artículo 73 de la Constitución mexicana estipulaba que un estado debe contar con una población superior a 80,000 habitantes y disponer de bases económicas suficientes para generar sus propios ingresos, cubrir los gastos de administración pública de la entidad y asegurar el bienestar económico y social de sus habitantes. Para lograr esto, el Estado se apoyó en dos proyectos económicos centrales. Uno, el polo turístico de Cancún, que es el que ustedes deben de poder ubicar, ¿no?, gracias a esta maquinaria de publicidad turística, y el otro, el ingenio azucarero al sur, ¿no?, en Álvaro Obregón, que son como que los dos polos económicos que permitieron la consolidación del estado de Quintana Roo. Bueno, en relación con esto, Elizabeth Bunyan también hace notar que como parte de este proyecto o revolucionario, lo que conocemos como hoy Quintana Roo entra en la sintonía del mestizaje, entendido el mestizaje como la ideología que consolida el proyecto de Estado-Nación mexicano, ¿no? En este sentido, el mestizaje tuvo como objetivo crear una identidad nacional, tomando como referencia esta diversidad de pueblos originarios y la relación que tuvieron con los españoles, ¿no?, y con la conquista. Pero esta ideología necesariamente, al menos a grandes rasgos, hace a un lado a la población afromexicana del país, y en el caso de Quintana Roo propiamente, a la población afrocaribeña, ¿no? ¿Por qué población afrocaribeña? Pues porque desde los inicios la zona sur de Quintana Roo era considerada como un punto de desplazamiento, de movilidad, ¿no?, con el territorio de hoy Belice, ¿no? Esta mexicanización se refleja, por tanto, en esta conceptualización de entender este territorio como la cuna del mestizaje, ¿no?, que lleva consigo la exclusión de ciertas experiencias caribeñas, pero también la exclusión de ciertas identidades, ¿no?, relacionadas con el Caribe. Es decir, fue necesaria la creación de una historia y una identidad en la consolidación del Caribe mexicano como proyecto. Y esto propició que se borrara la influencia afrocaribeña de la zona. De hecho, es bien curioso como en uno de los textos de Elizabeth Bunyan, en los cuales habla sobre la música del reggae, hace notar que justamente en la zona sur de Quintana Roo se escucha mucho reggae, pero esto no termina siendo un detonante de protesta política y de identificación de una política anclada en la cuestión afrocaribeña, ¿no? Es decir, ella dice en Quintana Roo nos gusta el reggae, pero no somos afro, ¿no? Esto es meramente una metáfora, pero tiene como objetivo poder dimensionar la ausencia de este otro Caribe, ¿no? Bueno, aquí vienen un poco este sistema de categorías en el cual igual estoy trabajando recientemente, que tienen como objetivo en primera instancia desatar diálogos, ¿no? Diálogos que considero necesarios para poder entender la peculiaridad del territorio al día de hoy, ¿no? Creo que inclusive podríamos hablar de entender el Caribe mexicano como una blancotopía, ¿no?, haciendo énfasis en esta connotación racista, ¿no?, entendiéndola por lo menos en tres primeros puntos de abordaje a través del mestizaje como un proyecto que homogeniza la identidad cultural, como un proyecto que borra y que inferioriza otras expresiones culturales, otras comunidades, ¿no? Sobre todo un proyecto que borra las aportaciones y que borra el legado político de muchas otras comunidades que no se ajustan con el ideal de qué podría ser lo mexicano, ¿no? Es un borramiento de la memoria y en consecuencia también podríamos decir un borramiento de su agencia política. También aunado a esto, me parece que podríamos considerar a esta zona como un lugar donde se va desarrollando y se va a desarrollar, sobre todo en la década de los 90, inicios de 2000, una separación bastante atenuada, ¿no?, bastante evidente entre dos tipos de población, ¿no? Aquella población que va a ser objeto, que va a poder tener el acceso para disfrutar el goce en este Caribe, en el Caribe mexicano, y propiamente también aquella población que va a sufrir de manera sistemática el racismo, ¿no? Entendiendo el racismo justamente no meramente como un prejuicio, sino como un sistema que va determinando como un sistema propiamente. Y también me parece importante agregar a esto, entender el turismo no nada más como una actividad económica, como un desarrollo que nos permite generar cierto tipo de economía, sino también como un proyecto de ordenamiento existencial, ¿no? Bajo estas tres tónicas, me parece importante por lo menos mencionar un par de cuestiones relacionadas con sí, un par de cuestiones para que podamos darnos una idea, ¿no? En qué sentido vamos a poder acercarnos a esta conceptualización de Caribe Alley, que es propiamente la que quiero que podamos pues, dialogar, discutir, y es justamente pensar cuáles son esas condiciones existenciales de vida en las cuales nuestra ciudadanía se puede ejercer de manera plena. Entendiendo esto, cuál es la posibilidad de que nuestros derechos y los derechos de quienes habitan en esta geografía sean respetados, ¿no? Esto para nada más darnos una idea del flujo de personas que transitan por acá. En esta nota de Melissa Mezcua en el Universal nos dicen en 2019 fueron 17 millones y en 2020, a pesar de la pandemia, lo visitaron 7 millones, ¿no? ¿A quién está refiriendo? A Quintana Roo. Tenemos al menos 3 millones de cuartos disponibles por mes para turistas. Los datos más recientes del Secretariado Ejecutivo del Sistema Nacional de Seguridad Pública ubican a este estado con el mayor índice de violación sexual por cada 100.000 habitantes en todo el país, con 26.29 casos de enero a julio. Al menos estas cifras tomando como referencia el 2021. Bueno, ¿qué podríamos pensar entonces sobre estas nociones, ¿no? ¿A dónde nos podrían llevar? A muchos lugares definitivamente, pero por lo menos quisiera que pudiésemos entender esta conceptualización, ¿no? Que es el Caribe Alien. Entiendo el Caribe Alien como una respuesta que no da por sí misma una solución, sino que más bien abre un sendero para poder investigar cuáles son estas características y estas condiciones de vida en el Caribe mexicano, ¿no? Revitalizando por completo estas nociones que este filósofo Kotwo Eshun menciona en este brillante texto que se llama Más brillante que el sol, en el cual habla sobre la categoría de alien para pensar lo alien como lo extranjero, ¿no? En este sentido, tomo esta categoría de alien para pensar justo cómo esta excepcionalidad de ciudadanía se desarrolla en el Caribe mexicano debido a la ausencia de pues, derechos que no nada más tienen que ver con los feminicidios, sino también derechos que están relacionados con los trabajadores de la industria turística, los trabajadores de la industria de desarrollo turístico, es decir, albañiles, etcétera, todos aquellos que participan y que, por ejemplo, son objetos del crimen organizado, ¿no? En ese sentido, creo que es importante poder revitalizar esta noción que en algún momento Frantz Fanon habló sobre la zona del ser y del no ser, entendiendo justamente la zona del no ser y del ser como esas dos categorías que nos permiten identificar en qué ámbitos se desarrollan los seres humanos, ¿no? Siendo la zona del ser, donde el ser humano puede desarrollarse, y la zona del no ser, donde los que existen y las que existen son no humanos. En este sentido, este entendimiento del turismo como un proyecto de existencia se puede reflejar en quiénes son las personas que pueden tener el ejercicio pleno de sus derechos y quiénes son también objeto de racismo y de folclorización, entendiendo estos dos términos y conceptos como conceptos que organizan todo un sistema social, ¿no? Muy bien, muy bien. Nada más para ir acotando un poco entonces, este Caribe Alien es una propuesta por repensar, ¿no? Por dinamitar, llamémoslo así, cierto tipo de nociones que pudiesen pensar ya establecidas, ¿no? Que pudiese desatar cierto tipo de diálogos, que pudiesen desatar justo también cierto tipo de acciones políticas para nombrar lo que sucede, ¿no? A pesar de las narrativas que despolitizan por completo esta zona. Entendiendo también que el Caribbean es una crítica al Estado-Nación y al proyecto del mestizaje, propone pensar nuestras identidades como una cuestión de estrategia y de una manera antiesencialista, ¿no? Esto quiere decir que que necesitamos necesariamente el diálogo y la cooperación de las y las personas para poder determinar hacia dónde queremos ir, ¿no? Entendiendo también que esta condición de extranjería o condición alien se desarrolla en la ciudadanía de Quintana Roo y que no es meramente una apreciación que pudiese quedar en un plano descriptivo como literario, sino que pudiese inclusive tomarse como punto de referencia para entender todas estas existencias que no están teniendo la posibilidad de desarrollar su vida de manera plena. Por último, y me parece también importante, la relevancia de estas conceptualizaciones, tomo como referencia este texto de Malcolm Ferdinand, ¿no? Un futuro llamado Haití, donde dice, nombrar un lugar, mucho menos toda la tierra, nunca ha sido una práctica neutral. Tiene, por tanto, una dimensión política. ¿Quién nace el nombramiento? ¿Quién tiene derecho a nombrar toda la tierra? ¿A quién va dirigido este nombre? ¿Y por qué este nombre debería ser el más común adoptado en la filosofía ambiental? Este texto hace referencia a estas conceptualizaciones de Gaia, ¿no? De toda esta filosofía ambiental que podemos encontrar en Bruno Latour, Isabel Strangers, etc. Pero lo que me interesa aquí es quedarnos justo con esta noción de quién nombra lo que nos rodea, bajo qué parámetros ese nombramiento adquiere una dimensión política, bajo qué parámetros ese nombramiento de lo existente puede justo alertarnos, ¿no? Sobre cuestiones que están pasando, sobre todo qué sentido tiene, qué dimensión política pudiese tener entender estas categorías como categorías que pueden reflejar referencias de significado, referencias de existencia, referencias de experiencias y sobre todo referencias de sentido en este lugar. Por último, y ya para terminar esto, también me parece importante poder establecer un diálogo con todos aquellos que forman parte, todas aquellas comunidades mayas, que también son objeto de este racismo y de folclorización y que ustedes pueden ver en todos estos festivales, ¿no? Que se dan en Xcaret, que se dan en la zona, sobre todo en la Quinta Avenida. Y este trabajo, por ejemplo, es un glifo maya que dice Caribe Alien, elaborado por el maestro José Coyoc, historiador ambiental, quien coordina el proyecto de caligrafía maya, un One Huitzil Chac caligrafía maya, y que tiene por objeto establecer este diálogo, ¿no? Poder establecer estos conceptos, poder establecer este nombramiento, poder establecer este reposicionamiento del Caribe desde un punto de vista crítico, también con aquellas personas que no nada más hablan español, sino también poder establecer un vínculo dialógico, un vínculo que nos permita, pues, crear otro tipo de imaginarios, imaginarios más críticos, imaginarios que puedan llevarnos a posicionarnos de otras maneras. Bueno, no sé, creo que ya no tengo tiempo, pero ¿sí todavía hay unos minutos? No, está bien. Pero bueno, esto es la propuesta y pues muchas gracias.
For anyone that's joined just for this panel or this afternoon, my name is Elizabeth Chant. I am last minute chairing this panel, so you get to hear more of me. But this is the third panel of Climate Capital and Tourism in the Americas, the final panel session titled Critical and Cultural Imaginaries. And we've got three really, I think, fascinating papers that are going to speak to each other in some really exciting ways. So without wasting too much time, I will jump straight in and introduce our first panelist, Ken Little. Ken's an associate professor of anthropology at York University in Canada, and Ken's research focuses on the analysis of society as spectacle, the critical turn in anthropology to affect studies, social creativity, experiments in ethnographic writing, and performativity. And Ken has published work over a variety of contexts in journals like the Journal of Tourism and Cultural Change, Emotion, Space and Society, and is the author of works in volumes like Tourism Imaginaries and Through the Anthropological Lens, Emotion in Motion, Tourism, Affect and Transformation, and the varieties of sensory experience. And Ken's work explores new ways of thinking tourism through flows, processes, and bodily interconnections in touristic encounters, attachments, production, and narratives as a means of tracking the enactments of subject making under the pressures of emergent transformations of public culture in neoliberal Belize. And he recently completed a book titled On the Nervous Edge of an Impossible Paradise, Affect Tourism Belize, that was published by Bergham Books in 2020. And Ken's going to be sharing, I believe, some research connected to that project today in For the Time Is at Hand, Miss Grace's Beast Time Flood. So please take it away, Ken.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to join this group, and greetings from Menorca. That's where I am. I'm part of a critical tourism studies group, and we've been with those meetings wrap up tomorrow. It's been great, and unfortunately I wasn't here yesterday, and the reason I wasn't here yesterday is because I was there working there. So I'm just going to jump right in, and the title is different now. That just happens. So once upon a time, a brutal flood devastated Wallaceville, Belize, issuing forth what Miss Grace called the beast. Miss Grace remembers only what flowed through her on that day. The beast time took firm grip in this make-believe seaside beach town, materializing out of bizarre mixtures of coastal enchantments, edgy giddiness, warm intensities, bad histories, lush Edenic images, rogue strife, a tensely capacious tactility when the flood surged and everything was swept away. That's when life turned impossible on the promise of a new millennial beginning. The flood was a nightmare, Grace said, clearer in that moment than she ever was. When the darkness fell, she, feel, house, lifting, floating, flooding across the village, tilting one way and another. A ship on a stormy sea, Miss Grace say, she with cat, dog, parrot, Bible in hand. The ark, like Noah, not like Noah. Things on surface of churning water that she want no part of. But like Noah, she whispered, God say we had it coming. At that moment, Grace felt that her time was at hand. Something crazy was beginning to happen. Something deeply felt as the beasts work. Belize time entered beast time with the flood. That traumatizing event gave everyone the jitters and sent a nervous shock through the village and the country that is still deeply felt today. The flood was a bad sign as it stirred up more bad signs, and the staggering staggering chaos of annihilating disaster that summoned a next one wave of world unmaking. This time, a shocking, uncontrollable surge of tourists with money, unrealistic ideas about life in the tropics, odd practices, fashions, diets, and focus. With the new flood of strangers appeared an all of a sudden stranger, doubtful nature, and a nervous economy building on some fractured image of a tropical paradise. Beast time energies, unsettling things fast and hard. Grace pray her obia protection curses, but the beasts come anyway, she said, and with it, a make-believe cursed dream world. If that was not enough, yet another beast smashed into Wallaceville. Disney and Norwegian Cruise Lines bought up Harvest Key, one of the most sensitive marine ecologies in southern Belize, that morphed wildly into a tropical never land, as they call it. They turned the key into a private investment scheme, an international cruise ship terminal and tourism village. One more bad sign. During the Wallaceville hearings from in the project, locals protested loudly. Cruise ship tourism was floating trouble, they said. Ron was an elected village spokesman for the hearings with the cruise reps to voice local displeasure, doubts, and alternatives. The village council chose Ron because he was one of Wallaceville's blue ribbon naturalists. He wins National Geographic and Belize Audubon Society Awards for his knowledge of local nature and culture. He has worked with the Jacques Cousteau Foundation and the Smithsonian on sustainable eco-tourist projects. His reputation is worldwide as the unflappable, reliable Creole exegete. I caught up with Ron on the evening he stomped out of the community meeting with the cruise reps. Ron was shaking mad. A cruise rep had just laid into him during a meeting of nearly 300 people as he voiced local opposition to the Harvest Key development. "You just don't get it, do you?" the cruise man spit, smiling hard at Ron. "You have to separate your emotions from the facts, Ron. Read the EIA. We have the facts, so calm down. Once you look at it rationally and understand the improvements in tourist industry investment we are making, you'll see the long-term benefits to the community. That's when I'll say, welcome aboard, Ron. And remember, just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right." Next person, please. Ron, an internationally trusted naturalist with impressive international credentials, the respected voice of local authority and reason, crushed. The sounds of waves breaking on the beach could not drown out the buzz of anguished hush that followed the cruise rep's litany of microaggressive commands. Without a word, as if it were choreographed, almost every local got up and out of the place, stunned. Wallaceville comes together for Ron through a relay of discontinuous and odd moments like this. In a flash, he can trace a litany of like moments of tortured torment when the trust in a service ethos, oh, where to go? There it is. A service ethos rubs up against an ever-expanding atmosphere that feels like out-of-control servitude. That's when things just fall apart. Accrued layers of remembered abuse building, ebbing, flowing like those endless waves on a Wallaceville shoreline as Ron struggles to find his calm, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the cruise ships are the newest servitude. The new slave boats, he calls them, shackling local efforts of life, however, or forevermore to cruise capitalism's extractive ecologics. So the cruise ship tourists came. Little useful infrastructure followed. Limited jobs, nothing much accumulated, but failed promises, clogged toilets, ship garbage, fuel oil slicks, land extractions, a diminishing supply of potable water, bad health, and abandoned, disappointed locals. Miss Grace saw it coming. Up until the day she died of COVID, the 19, she could not shake the impossible event. And ever since the flood, she felt strongly that the beast had shackled a big part of her community's soul to its appetites. That's when Grace wheezed her Obia incantations for the last time. Beast time, believes it or not. It was not lost on anyone that the first encounters with the 19 were with cruise tourists coming off those ships, sick with the flu. Notorious for spreading whatever communicable diseases tourist ships carried, locals had to get used to getting sick with cruise bugs. However, historically, that's always that has been the cost of forcibly having lives tied to imperial travel, Ron says. But this time, the costs were much too high. So many locals sick and dying. Eventually, the cruise ships became such a deadly health menace that even their Belize government cronies had to shut them out. But damage done. Toysi wrote a poem after Miss Grace died. She was shaken angry. There it is. I'm going to just go through. I won't read it. COVID seized the village in miasmic belches. Cruise tourists sweat, spit, piss, and shit, seeping into everything, swirling virus into sand, sea, and bodies. But the COVID rules were finally posted. Best regulation enforcement in Belize history, locals joke. Expat tourists were stuck in paradise, though, and didn't like that one bit. Any loss of their freedoms was considered bad. But she won't wear a mask and she won't control those kids. They are everywhere, Miss Parka complained to me midway through the first lockdown. Once again, Parka was talking about the Texas Johnsons, that wild and unruly evangelical expat family who could never be told what to do or how to live their libertarian paradise freedoms, even during the lockdown. But it was too late. Everyone was sick or looking after seriously sick family members. The beast shackling itself to dead and the dying. Miss Parka is regionally acknowledged to have gifts that connect her with her ancestors in countless ways. She casts number spirals into the world. She calls them connective tissue for weaving worlds in this little place that she loves so dearly. But by the time of the pandemic, Parka was a well-respected local elder with a reputation for being a paradise dream world pain in the ass because she had become popular for back-talking paradise while conjuring worlds otherwise. She insisted from the beginning of the pandemic on following the COVID rules and that her kin follow suit. Get vaxxed, don't follow the MAGA Johnsons. They use ivermectin. Mask up, back up, wash up. Still, so much named family COVID illness and death. Parka gets asked constantly to use her number spells to deal with the forces of the 19. Yet she is drawn to other lines and leaps of affinity and affiliation, entangled paths of collective survival at the apotheosis of 500 years of colonial violence, white supremacy, mass extractions, worsening weather, and the hubris of the human exceptionalism, actively terraforming her precious little bit of the planet with beastly forces that rattle her bones. Her numbers are conjured in swirls that compose into flashes of clarity about things which will have been. I'm speaking to you from the future, Parka says. We need her love. It's a local logic for staying with the trouble, a powerful force of active imagination. When Parka works with her numbers, she can smell them like ozone. She can feel their energy, their heat, their intensity, the hard and soft push and pull of the relational pressure when things come into touch with each other. Turned into a conduit of transitional contact, caught in the flesh of touching bone, touching breath, touching tides, mangroves, ancestors, time, space. It is necessary for her to stay with the intensity of this active emergence, or the flash will push in on Parka like the clammy, wet weight of a very bad day. Parka's flashes are contact zones of roiling multiplicities that figure through the unstable yet forceful conjury of sensations. Such things glow, Parka says. They are acts of passionate convulsion that manifest in bits of matter, in everyday events, sensations, in bones and dreams that continuously compose and decompose things for her as she conjures futures meant to change things up in this new world of chronic viral entanglement, an emergent social real in Wallaceville. Right now, things are more strained than ever between Wallaceville cruise tourists, tourist expats, and locals. The tension, everyone agrees, is COVID related, but it is a much deeper problem. Official state and tourist interests see Parka as a bad example That's because she never talks sense. Anything that she tries to do with her numbers is immediately measured by financial metrics, the logic of liberal reason and sense certainty. And so her conjuring acts are deemed to be irrational wastes of time, nonsense. If Parka's number flashes get repurposed at all, it's as an example of exotic local culture, and so it is made to fit the savage logics that Michel Rolfe-Criot evokes that help motivate the seductions of Caribbean tropicalizations used to sell the place to tourists. But in Creole, nonsense is an inspiration for Parka's number backtalk and another sense of time-space relations. Kairos, not chronos. Parka's unruly number worlds of connection include tourists, but they are so much more entangled and emergent than just that. Her number swirls conjure a type of Creole nonsense called backchat, and that is intimately connected with compassion. For Parka, compassion is a contagion, a disturbance of violent relatedness because it ruptures closely guarded visions of paradise dream worlds and the calculating chronos that underwrites them and the financializations of local life. Compassion flips the beast and the beast's power and adds to that power with yet another promise of monsters. The promise of monsters is regenerative because it is an invitation to explore new ways of being in touch, new forms of becoming, new possibilities of kinship, history, alliance, and change that Parka says can help us make our future. Parka calls her number swirls wake-up calls, calculations of novel connection, the nonsense meant to shake us up out of Ixtabe's numbing anesthetic of paradise slumber, to feel other worlds of possibility and other kinds of forces being generated in their making. Out of her number fractures, worlds turn monstrous as they backtalk the fraying splinters of those sticky late liberal political fantasies of possession, property, and identity. And so they're always one jump ahead of the rules. Generative felt affirmations, not logical negations. That's incantation. That, the magic that protects Parka from the beast. So her number spells so lovingly conjured for the community to thwart the beast spell, one flash after another brings substance to life, and so other forces of power to bear. Today, Parka is harder at this community work than she has ever been. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ken. Fantastic. So we're going to pass over now to Ross Swanson. Ross is a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Toronto, where he's working on the figure of the Amazonian shaman in relation to environmentalist and decolonial discourses in recent Latin American literature and film. And Ross is going to be sharing a paper with us today titled Ayahuasca for the Anthropocene, Shamanism, Illness and Ecological Allegories in Ikarosa Vision by Leonor Cabrajo and Mateo Norzi. So please go ahead, Ross, whenever you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And it's great to be here. I've also changed my title a little bit to Ayahuasca for the Anthropocene, De-Dramatizing Shamanic Tourism in Ikarosa Vision. And today in my presentation, I'll analyze, like the title says, the de-dramatization of shamanic ayahuasca tourism and the colonialist narratives of overcoming or conquering nature in this film, from 2015. By the New York-based directors Leonor Caravaggio and Mateo Norzi, who are originally from Argentina and Uruguay, respectively. So after a brief contextualization, I'll show how the film de-dramatizes ayahuasca tourism and colonialist narratives by playing with spectator expectations and through its creative engagement with archival works. So this engagement undermines the faith in miracle cures and triumphalism of colonialist narratives that are a foundation for contemporary shamanic tourism in the Amazon region. So I will end my presentation with a reflection on how the film's treatment of nature also subtly challenges contemporary faith in miracle solutions for the current Anthropocene climate and ecological crisis. So before beginning with my analysis, I'll contextualize this shamanic ayahuasca tourism. So ayahuasca, which is also referred to as yaje in Colombia and Ecuador, is an ancient psychoactive brew that is made from a vine and is used by indigenous and mestizo shamans of the Amazon basin. More recently, ayahuasca has become a major tourist attraction for those seeking authentic experiences in the company of shamans, especially in the Peruvian city of Iquitos. Ayahuasca shamanism is also known not only for its spiritually enlightening visions, but also for its healing powers. And many popular culture sources describe ayahuasca shamans as capable of curing diseases like drug addiction, depression, diabetes, and even cancer. But even beyond the use in tourism, ayahuasca and shamanism are inextricably entangled in the history of colonialism and capitalist extraction in the Amazon. So according to anthropologist Beatriz Cayubila Bachi and her collaborators, a major factor in the growth of the spread of ayahuasca was the Amazonian rubber boom of the late 19th and 20th century, through which indigenous and non-indigenous workers came into close contact. And more generally, Amazonian shamanism has fascinated colonizers, right, since colonial times. Michael Taussig has argued in detail that under Spanish colonialism, shamans were conflated with the European figure of the wild man and have been attributed with fearful mystical powers to both heal and harm. And over the 20th century, ayahuasca use has featured in scientific writing, literature, and film, both within and beyond Latin America. According to several commentators, these representations have increased the international profile of ayahuasca and drawn visitors looking for contact with the authentic original. Examples include everything from ethnographic and ethnobotanical work to the Yahe letters from the 1960s by William Burroughs, or more recently, the 2015 Colombian film, The Embrace of the Serpent by Ciro Guerra, and there's many more examples. So Ikarosa Vision is part of this ongoing literary and cinematic engagement with shamanism and ayahuasca. It tells the story of Angelina, who is a white woman from New York, like the directors, who travels to the city of Iquitos, and there she registers in a shamanic ayahuasca retreat called Anaconda Cosmica, or the Cosmic Anaconda. It soon becomes clear that she has been diagnosed with cancer and has come to the retreat in search of a miracle cure. But rather than a miracle cure, she's given a shamanic co-diagnosis, susto, something like fear or shock, by the young shaman Arturo. Arturo is himself suffering from a disease that is causing him to go blind. And a third ailing patient is the Amazonian natural world that accompanies the characters throughout the film, but most notably in scenes that follow Arturo's mother as she travels along Amazonian rivers, past sawmills and sugarcane plantations. Importantly, the film references two works of the Amazonian Cinematic and Literary Archive, the German director Werner Herzog's 1982 film Fitzcarraldo, and the novel The Three Halves of Hino Moxo, Las Tres Mitades de Hino Moxo, by the Peruvian Cesar Calvo. So the first way that the film de-dramatizes shamanic tourism is by playing with spectator expectations about this kind of tourism. So Angelina, the American traveler, takes the place of the typical white protagonist at the beginning of the film. She's coming to the Amazon in search of healing. And early on, we see her riding through Iquitos streets in a typical moto taxi, or a motorized rickshaw. She asks the driver to stop in front of a well-kept shamanic retreat with the name Sanjay Miracle Healer on the gate. And viewers expect her to enter this all too touristy, commercialized, and therefore inauthentic sort of retreat. But it turns out she only stopped to ask for directions. She continues on to Anaconda Cosmica, that seems to be more authentic, right? It's in the middle of the jungle and consists of buildings with palm-thatched roofs. However, viewers aren't allowed to enjoy the supposed authenticity for very long. The camera dwells on the English signs in the retreat, the foreign guests, and Angelina's cash payment for her stay. The de-dramatization of shamanic tourism also comes through the way the film plays with spectator expectations about ayahuasca's much hyped miraculous healing powers. Although these miracle cures are evoked repeatedly in the film, Angelina's cancer is not cured, and at the end of the film, she actually dies of it. And instead, as mentioned, Arturo gives her the shamanic co-diagnosis of susto, which is characterized by excessive fear expressed in bodily responses. The disease, he assures her, can be cured with ayahuasca and Ikaros, which are the shamanic chants that give the film its title. So Arturo's blindness follows a similar sort of pattern. At first, when he first notices the symptoms, Arturo seeks help from the master shaman Guillermo, speculating that he had been cursed. And so in this way, the film plays into spectator expectations about the mystical authenticity of shamans. And Guillermo protects Arturo through an ayahuasca ritual. However, this mystic aura is revoked immediately after the ritual, as Guillermo tells Arturo in a matter-of-fact way that while he's now protected from curses, he has a medical condition and should go see a doctor. However, the film doesn't allow Western medicine to step in as a miracle cure either. In the city, the doctor diagnoses Arturo with an incurable disease that will lead to blindness. And to slow the process, he tells Arturo to stop smoking the mapacho cigarettes that are used in shamanism because they irritate his eyes. But immediately after the appointment, Arturo goes to the market and buys the cigarettes against the doctor's orders. When Angelina confronts him about it, he counters that the doctor told me he couldn't help me. And by contrast, the cigarettes, he says, are good for getting rid of bad thoughts. Angelina reminds him that she was also diagnosed with an incurable disease, but that with his help, she had now recovered from the susto. No? Arturo and Angelina's acceptance of their diseases in these scenes neither negates the gravity of their respective diagnoses, nor presents them with melancholy or tragic overtones. And in this way, the film undermines common narratives of dramatic struggles to overcome, disease against all odds. And immediately after this scene, the film references Fitzcarraldo by Werner Herzog. The engagement with Fitzcarraldo undermines colonialist narratives that privilege a similar sort of dramatic struggle to overcome, but this time nature or hostile natives, right? And these are narratives that are very common in the literary and cinematic works that drive contemporary tourism in the Amazon. And Fitzcarraldo is a good example, right? It's set during the late 19th century rubber boom, follows an enterprising Irishman named Fitzcarraldo, who enters the rubber business to fund his dream of building an opera house in Iquitos. And to access the rich rubber-producing areas, he convinces an indigenous tribe to haul his steamship over a steep hill. The film makes its appearance in Ikaros just after the scene in the market, as the protagonists enter a local bar where scenes from Fitzcarraldo are projected onto a screen beside a swimming pool. So as you can see here, the film Fitzcarraldo is reflected into the water of the pool. Angelina is fascinated by this, and she dives into the water, distorting the reflected image so that it becomes unrecognizable. The sequence continues with Angelina breaking the reflection in the water as the iconic image of Fitzcarraldo defiantly playing opera music into the jungle is projected onto the screen behind her. So it's hard to dissociate Angelina's actions here from the imagery of baptism or immersion into healing waters, since it coincides with her recovery from susto that she had announced moments earlier. And the fact that she deforms precisely this image that indexes Fitzcarraldo's triumphant Eurocentrism suggests that her healing is related to a disruption of colonialist narratives of superiority over material conditions. Simultaneously, though, the scene denies the possibility of simply erasing the coloniality that Fitzcarraldo's image stands in for. Although she breaks the image, she is also literally immersed inside of it, no? And here again, the film refuses to admit an easy miracle solution, just like, colonialism cannot be simply erased like this, right? Although Angelina breaks the colonialist imagery, she remains subject to the capitalist and colonialist power dynamics that underwrite her position as a tourist. So I'll conclude with a brief reflection on the film's understated comment on the dying natural world of the Amazon. As mentioned, nature appears most notably as a backdrop to Arturo's mother's travel by boat. And the riverbank landscapes of these trips shows the devastating impacts of extractivism on the forest. And again, it plays with our expectations. We don't see the expected verdant jungle, right? But instead, we see an Anthropocene landscape of sugarcane plantations, sawmills, clear cuts. And here too, the Amazonian archive is referenced. During these scenes, Angelina reads excerpts from the Three Halves of Inomoxo in a voiceover. And the poetic passages that she reads from Calvo's novel describe a Baroque proliferation of biodiversity that contrasts with the sparse vegetation and the sounds of chainsaws in these scenes. Calvo's novel, which is about a voyage to find the reclusive master shaman Inomoxo, is often listed as recommended reading for shamanic tourists. In the film, it's presented as a shamanic guidebook, and Angelina appears reading it on several occasions. Still, in a way like the treatment of Fitzcarraldo, the novel is de-dramatized in Ikaros. And near the end of the film, Angelina reads excerpts that speak of a certain plants that are good for diseases like diabetes and cancer. However, these excerpts have been altered by the filmmakers. Calvo's original text asserts that these same plants cure these diseases. This editing extends to the film's subtle treatment of ecological crisis. Later, excerpts that Angelina reads tells viewers that in the jungle, you can hear, and I cite from the film, you can hear the future, just like the fish did before the flood. And so many lives that know what's going to happen, but cannot talk to us, warn us. The reference here to a mythical deluge and warnings of a catastrophic future evoke the end of the world. But this message does not appear in Calvo's novel. Rather, the excerpt has been creatively pieced together from fragments of Calvo's text by the filmmakers. So even as the film evokes the ecological and climate crisis and suggests that it's apparent to those who listen to the jungle, it doesn't suggest that shamanic tourism necessarily holds solutions to miraculously overcome it, just as it cannot provide miraculous cures for the protagonist's diseases. So, however, this ending isn't devoid of hope for the future either. By playing with spectator expectations and referencing archival works, the film points to the merits of de-dramatized acceptance and adaptation, alongside the possibilities for transformation that the critical and creative engagement with narratives of colonialist triumph enable, right? Even if a total escape from them is ultimately beyond reach. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ross, as well, and right on time as well. I didn't even have to warn you, so that was fantastic. Thank you. Excellent. Right. Well, now we'll pass over to our final speaker, Carol Darien. And before I get it wrong, Carol, have you changed your title?
I've called it Mass Tourism in the West Indies, Contemporary Colonialism in the Caribbean.
Great, that is the title I have in my notes, so that's fantastic. And apologies to Ross and Ken for reading out the wrong titles. But so Carol is currently a PhD student in anthropology at Carleton University in Canada, and Carol's research focuses on adaptation to crises and disasters. And Carol is currently working on adaptive methods taken by working women in St. Martin following Hurricane Irma's passage on the island in 2017. And Carol has a previous career in change management and crisis communications in the political and public sectors. So I'm sure she has some really exciting insights to share with us. So please go ahead, Carol.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, Elizabeth, and your team for organizing a fabulous 2 days with some really fascinating speakers. And my mind is already going into a bit of overtime. As Elizabeth kindly introduced, I'm a doctoral candidate at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, but I'm currently in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is a coastal province of Canada, doing digital field work. And to that end, before I start, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. And I respectfully acknowledge the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, in which I'm based, in which the city of St. John's is the capital city, as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk. Today, these lands are home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. I would also like to acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Mi'kmaq, Inuit, and Southern Inuit of this province. I commit to working harmoniously and respectfully with all peoples residing on this land to protect this earth and water for future generations. So I'll get to the presentation. Quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe my research work and the framing that I followed, some of the findings, and maybe finish off with a couple of reflections. And I would hope that that I will present something interesting to this audience and get some interesting feedback, especially on the reflections. So I'll just jump into the central argument of my research. The paper that I presented to this conference. And essentially the principal argument, or the central argument, is that mass tourism reinforces and proliferates a form of contemporary colonialism in the Caribbean. And in particular, advocating a tourism plantation economy, which reinforces the neoliberal agenda that's advocated by Western commercial and transnational interests. And also, this contemporary colonialism advocates a form of necropolitics, and that by maintaining and subjugating a primarily female population through enslavement and subjugation, through forms of active sexism, active racism, and work precarity. Now, my research is based in Saint Martin in the French West Indies. And I chose it because the island itself is administered through two separate entities. The Dutch, often referred to as the Dutch side, which is Saint Martin, and the French side, which is Saint Martin. On the Dutch side, it is the island is considered a constituent country of the Republic of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. But it maintains, the Dutch kingdom maintains civil security and financial control of the activities of the island. On the French side, the island is considered an overseas territory and an administrative responsibility of Guadeloupe through the French Republic. It operates in a civil law system, and it is very, although very different. They're both colonial in nature, and they are extremely harmonious. So it's a very interesting site. And primarily in this environment of climate change and climate change impacts, it is an interesting but very fragile ecological system. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So, and how am I doing it? Well, essentially it's through secondary sources from academic and non-academic authors, and from an anthropological and political economy lens. And I just finished my first round of field work. I just did 5 months, and I'm currently processing that data. As you know, I'm just going to blow through these things. And these are just extra observations that provide a bit of context to the research. I'm looking in particular the last 5 years since Hurricane Irma, which was an extremely destructive event in St. Martin's history, and how the female population is coping at this moment from an anthropological and a political economy lens. And by researching this a bit more, this is my theory, and it will probably form part of my final dissertation, at least one of the chapters, is this plantation economy that is exercised through mass tourism. I'm looking at the human impacts of that industry, and particularly on a female population, because the tourism economy is normally unstable, and it's particularly low yielding for any of the workers in it. And there is, through mass tourism, there's a continued history of exploitation and of cultural exploitation. And we also see in St. Martin a monoculture and a cheap labor. All of this pulls together in this environment of crisis decision-making, in disaster recovery, a very interesting cultural and anthropological dynamic. And that's where I'm going from an academic perspective. To give you an idea of the theoretical frameworks, well, this is where I went through. I started off with the considerable anthropological thinkers of Trouillot, César, and Sidney Mintz, and with a background in Eric Wolf, looking at the anthropological, historical, and political, cultural underpinnings of the region. I added a number of scholars, particularly from a Western perspective, in both political economy, tourism, and anthropology. Schiller, Bonilla, Barrios, Gaillard, Wang, and going through a lot of some of the Caribbean-based journals. What really piqued my attention was the shift I've seen, and we've seen it through Wang, Mosdale, and Bianchi over the past decade, in the second decade of this millennia. Tourism as a means of development, and looking tourism not necessarily as an economic driver, but as a maintenance form, a cultural maintenance, and a political and economic maintenance. So again, that piques my attention, and I find that a very unique situation in the Caribbean, but not necessarily an isolated situation from a global perspective, and particularly interesting in a rapidly changing ecological framework of with small island states that are suffering from, or are currently suffering, or soon to be suffering from warming oceans and sea level rises. From a pragmatic perspective, it's been really interesting. The island of Saint Martin has a relatively young, dominantly female population with a limited education, occupying the vast majority of the jobs, which is supplemented by transient and non-contributing North American and Western and European expats. The island economy itself is primarily 2/3 of the gross national revenue is through tourism services and marine support. By marine support, I refer to small craft repair, large craft provisioning. It is very much a hub of for people that are in the marine industry, not just commercial, but also recreational. The economy is supplemented from with funding from the two patron nations, extensive airport and seaport fees, a very active offshore banking industry, and what I euphemistically call recreational markets, which includes a gambling industry and a sometimes legal, sometimes illegal entertainment industry. The political and legal dynamics of the island are very, very interesting from the context of climate and climate change, and culture, and tourism. It's a constituent country of the Dutch Kingdom, as I mentioned, but it has low, and the control, which the Dutch Kingdom controls the military and the financial oversight. However, it does elect local representatives to administer service delivery and service programs. There is a stronger colonial push on the French side, where there's far more expat representation and far more accountability to France in their operations. Environmentally and ecologically, it's a primarily coastal settlements, 70-odd square kilometers, with scraggy, inhabitable, mountainous inland. The ecology is strongly degraded because of salt exploitation, which interestingly continued up to the mid-20th century. But it also has an incredibly unstable food supply, which is supplemented by exports. About a little shy, I think it's a little shy of 90% of food exports come through the seaport channels, and dominantly from North America and from Europe. So, what is that? Come on now. where am I? Oop, let me see. It doesn't want to move forward. Where are the little things? There you go. There you go. My preliminary findings. Well, the capital and the consumption levels on the island seem to intersect to maintain colonial control in the political and economic future of the region and to create very clear social and economic hierarchies. Therefore, it replicates the plantation economy. That is my dominant argument after preliminary findings. And I'll tell you why I came to that conclusion, based on the research and based on my first observations and a little bit of primary data collection. Over the past decades, when tourism really came to the fore in St. Martin, which would have been in the 50s and 60s, there's been an increasingly widening disparity between economic classes, between what I would call the economic and political elite, families that have been on the island since the 18th and 19th centuries, and what I would call the indigent population. When it comes to securing employment, which is primarily driven by the tourism industry, there's an incredible reliance on racist, sexist, ageist, and classist systems.
That's left, sorry.
Okay, that's quite all right. I'm on my last slide. And in securing employment, it's often based on what we have on people connections, therefore, and family relations, very much based on on social relations. The state and the West become are passive participants, and there's exhausted ecosystems that are propped by Western imports. And another finding that in critical tourism studies, there's a dearth of work done from an anthropological perspective. I lied. There's yet another slide. These are very strong. These are questions that are continuing. In particular, would the ongoing study of mass tourism from an anthropological and political economy lens continue to be worthwhile? How do ongoing climate change impacts figure in the long-term development thinking of St. Martin the next 10, 15, 20 years, especially in a recurring environment where there's stronger, more frequent hurricanes, a stronger ecological damage, and where do women fit in this structure? A group that is highly marginalized in disaster settings, and how can that power be leveraged amongst the female population? So that is a summary of what my research is. I'd certainly welcome any sort of commentary and any sort of challenge. I appreciate that as I'm working through this as a potential chapter in my dissertation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carol. I really enjoyed that. Welcome to the final session of Climate Capital and Tourism in the Americas. We're going to be closing off our 2 days with the second of our keynote sessions. And in this final session, we're going to be hearing from Professor Jim Ackerman, who's kindly joining us from Chicago this afternoon. And Jim is the director of the Herman Dunlap Smith Center for the History of Cartography, and also the curator of maps at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And Jim received his PhD in geography from Penn State University previously, and while his initial work focused on the history of the Atlas, his recent work, which I'm sure many of you in the audience will probably be familiar with, has focused on issues of popular and commercial cartography, especially travel and transportation mapping in the US, and also more broadly, the mapping of place in civic and political culture. I'm sure many of you as well will be familiar with Jim's contributions to volumes like The History of Cartography. He's also edited or co-edited 6 collections of essays, including most recently Mapping Nature Across the Americas, which you should all definitely check out if you haven't already, which came out with Chicago last year. in collaboration with Kathleen A. Brosnan. And Jim has also had a profiled career as well in exhibitions, and particularly the exhibition of maps, and his most recent exhibition at the Newberry Crossings, Mapping American Journeys, closed just recently, last week, I believe, is that right? On the 25th of June. And we're really delighted to be hearing from Jim this afternoon, a talk titled Mapping Climate For/Through the Eyes of Tourists. So Jim, please go ahead and take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Liz. I'm really delighted to be asked to talk to you today. And I just was telling Liz in a few minutes previous that the invitation really sparked me to try to get a handle on this, which is a somewhat new topic for me. Obviously, the topic of climate is very topical, but thinking about how tourism mapping sheds light on climate is something new for me. So this is very much, I guess you'd say, an experimental talk, and I look forward to questions and discussions that come afterwards. In 2009, at the International Conference in the History of Cartography in Bern, I'm sorry, it's 2007, in Bern, Switzerland, I heard two Swiss scholars, David Steiner and Heinz-Jürg Zumbühl, give a paper entitled The Significance of Old Maps for Glacier Research. The paper focused on a topographic survey, the so-called Dufour map, created between 1832 and 1864, and in particular on its mapping of the Untergrindelwald Glacier completed in 1862. 12 years later, in 1874, a second topographic survey was conducted in the same region, giving scientists then and now an early opportunity to gauge the retreat of the glacier during the period of substantial warming in the region in the mid-19th century. In the same study, the authors examined photos taken during the Dufour survey, and the photo on the left here is one of those, and compared them with later ones. By now, these comparative images of glaciers around the world are common parts of public discourse about global warming. But I think it was listening to this talk that sparked an early interest in the subject of climate and me, because when I was seeing these photographs, and given that it was coming out of Switzerland, which is a mecca for alpine tourism, I was very interested to find out. I started thinking about how these celebrated iconic panoramas of the Alps appearing in Baedeker guidebooks and other guidebooks starting in the mid-19th century might themselves be sources for comparative climate comparisons. I'm not aware of any scholarship along these lines, but if anybody knows of someone who's doing this work, I'd certainly welcome any suggestions. These images were often produced from photographs or they were drawn on site, but they should not be considered snapshots of the Alps in a particular place and time. As a publication for tourists, they are a somewhat romanticized representation. The expanse of whiteness in the lower image in particular, which has the benefit of the use of color printing, is not at odds with my own personal experience of the Alps in summertime, recalled from two separate visits in 1987 and 2007. But it must be understood that the two images are engaged not only in articulating the scene for the viewer, that is, naming peaks, glaciers, and other features, but are more importantly promoting it, encouraging an appreciation for the conditions of elevation and climate that have created this beautiful scene. In a somewhat more stylized and exaggerated way, we can see this at work in the Americas in 20th century views promoting Glacier National Park in Montana and the adjacent Canadian Waterton Lakes National Park. The Shining Mountains promoted as the American Alps. Capital is at work here. Like many Western national parks, the creation of Glacier Park was promoted by a transcontinental railway, the Great Northern, that would transport alpine-starved Easterners and Midwesterners to winter and summer pursuits provided by the glaciers and mountains and the glacial meltwater. From one brochure, we have this statement. Glacier National Park in the Montana Rockies is a vast area of mountain peaks and valleys that constantly presents new scenic vistas in every direction. There is so much to see and so much to enjoy that all sense of time seems to disappear. The pollen-free air is so fresh and clean, the mountains and valleys are so peaceful, you soon acquire a new and glorious feeling of how you'll sleep and eat. Visitors invariably voice highest praise for Glacier Park's rugged and truly unspoiled wilderness of peaks, crags, lakes, and streams. Multicolored mountains support snow-patched peaks and ancient glaciers. The National Park Service, the melting ice and snow from the glaciers form brilliant jade green lakes, jewel-like in their matchless settings and teeming with fighting trout. In this paper, then, I consider how American tourist maps, as well as guidebooks, and the interests that created and distributed them historically, have represented climate as a desirable feature targeting places and regions, in targeted places or regions, or more precisely, present climatic conditions so as to make these places appealing. It is perhaps obvious that ski resorts present winter or a reliably snowy winter as an amenity for tourists. And I note, we all know that how this reliably snowy winter is a problematic feature for many ski resorts around the world. But there are nuances here, not the least being what happens when the climate changes and ski resorts suffer. There are many other ways in which climatic conditions have played a major role in tourism promotion, and the design choices made by map makers and graphic publishers have singled out or reinforced climatic stereotypes. The diversity of climates in the United States, the relative mobility of its population, and the vigor of domestic tourism bring these into high relief. We should begin by acknowledging that the promotion of climate on maps serving American colonization, of which tourism is certainly a part, was not new to the 19th or 20th centuries. As early as John Smith's map of Virginia, famous map of Virginia from 1612, he is at pains to note the different tree types that are available in the area, both as sources of timber and indicating some to those who are familiar with it, an English climate, perhaps even arguing that there are similar climatic conditions prevailing. Similarly, Samuel de Champlain's map, Carte de la Nouvelle-France from 1632, in the lower left of the map, in the southwest portion of the map, locates not only thriving indigenous villages, but places of cultivation, as if to underscore that those colonists who might be coming to these regions to seek pursuits, agricultural pursuits, will find precedence in the native, in the cultivation already conducted by indigenous people. In the 19th century, references to climate in American maps, particularly maps of the American West, are more explicit. This very famous map by Stephen Long, published in 1823 and based on his accounts, his expeditions up the Missouri and Platte River in 1819 and 1920, assigns the name to what is now the Great Plains as the Great American Desert. Someone accompanying him on this, Edwin James, a naturalist who accompanied Long on this expedition, said, "I do not hesitate in giving the opinion that it is almost wholly unfit for cultivation, and of course, uninhabitable by people depending upon agriculture for their subsistence. Although tracts of fertile land, considerable land are occasionally to be met with, yet the scarcity of wood and water is almost uniformly prevalent and will prove an insuperable obstacle in the way of settling the country." Later promoters of migration and development of infrastructure worked aggressively to counter this claim. In several works published in the 1860s and 1870s, William Gilpin, the first governor of the state of Colorado, and an aggressive promoter of the Kansas Pacific Railroad and Colorado mining interests, argued that it was Americans, that is, more specifically civilized white people, their destiny to develop the portion of what he called the trans-global temperate climatic belt, which is indicated on this map, and the construction of transcontinental railroads was implicated in particular in these schemes. The map is similar in spirit to the world map found in many editions of George Crowfoot's Transcontinental Railroad Guide for Tourists, which was popular in the 1870s after the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, which positions the Transcontinental Railroad in the middle of this climatic belt, linking Asia and Europe. Also appearing in Crowfoot's guide is this famous image of American progress, an image which was based on John Gast's 1872 painting, which will be familiar to many of you, but which was commissioned specifically by Crowfoot for his tourist's guide. The image is an allegory for an American brand of Western civilization, bringing, as it marched to the West, a climate of bringing change in the moral climate of the country by bringing technology to it, and also underscoring the notion of cultivation that is going to follow in the wake of this. Gilpin's map and similar ones is embedded, of course, in the general interest starting at the beginning of the 19th century in mapping climatic conditions, spurred especially by the several versions of the Chimborazo volcano in the Andes, which was developed by Alexander von Humboldt to show climatic change by moving up successive belts of altitude. We find another similar echo of transglobal climate belts in this map by Alexander Keith Johnston, based on Berghaus's earlier atlas, which shows the tropical, temperate, and desert regions that are affected by global belts of precipitation. Humboldtian science greatly influenced the scientists who participated in a host of American exploring expeditions in the Trans-Mississippi West, most notably the Pacific Railroad surveys of the 1850s, which produced not only extensive observations and images of mountain and desert landscapes, but also a few notable maps on the effects of climate. One of my favorites is this by the botanist John Milton Bigelow, who participated in the survey of a possible route along the 35th parallel, which includes an extensive profile of different types of trees and other vegetation that could be found as one progressively crosses through and over the mountains. The importance of noting the trees was particularly important, noting the abundance of potential lumber sources for the construction of railroads, but it is also making a reference to the future cultivatability and development possibilities of this area based on climatic conditions. Remarks along the same lines, from the 1820s, it had become standard procedure in guidebooks published to lure immigrants to the Midwest to invoke the fair quality of the local climate. Remarks are generally sober, acknowledging the existence of winter in the Midwest, but also making a point to compare the comparable latitudes within the Midwest to areas already deemed quite acceptable for European colonization, not only in Europe itself, but in comparable latitudes on the Atlantic coast of the United States. In his guide for immigrants to Michigan, John Farmer, for example, notes, quote, "The climate of the surveyed part of the territory is mild, lying between 41 degrees 39 minutes and 42 degrees 34 minutes north latitude. The air is salubrious and the water generally pure and healthy. The soil, which produces in rich abundance wheat, rye, barley, oats, peas, beans, Indian corn, and potatoes, as well as all kinds of vegetables, usually cultivated in the same latitude. The map accompanying this focused on the progress of the land surveys that were done, and also notes the prevalence of water in the area, underscoring the suitability of the soil, water supply, and climate for cultivation. Along similar lines, Henry Abel and Samuel Augustus Mitchell team up to produce a map luring, a decade later, luring immigrants to the Wisconsin territory. Here is an excerpt, which I will not ask you to read, which talks about, again, the climate, makes a strong comparison of the climate to that parts of two areas in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which would be at comparable latitudes. An interesting twist on this, as the path of migration moved farther west, stimulated by the construction of transcontinental railroads across the Great Plains, especially after the American Civil War in the 1870s and 1880s, entered drier areas such as Nebraska and Kansas, who were at pains to fight against the notion of this being the Great American Desert. Charles Dana Wilbur was a proponent of the theory that the rain follows the plow, which asserted that cultivation itself would liberate moisture in the soil and contribute to a more humid climate. And he documents this with a couple of rain charts showing differences in rainfall over a very recent period of 10 to 15 years. There's a little more where he gets into this. The railroad companies themselves, which had these large grants of land that they promoted and tried to develop in order to support the rail line, in their appeals to tourists would acknowledge the changes in the suitability of the climate for particular types of cultivation as one moves farther west. So in the eastern part of Nebraska, it identifies the suitable development for agricultural lands, while calling attention to grazing lands farther west. In an era when, earlier in the 19th century, in an era when rivers and waterways were considered the best routes for travelers, guidebooks were also at pains to warn travelers about the need to adjust to climatic conditions. The famous guidebook to navigation on the Ohio and Mississippi River, published by Zadok Kramer, of which we're seeing an 1814 edition, makes note of the need to time one's departure down the river, and this is in the era before the steamboat, when people were largely navigating their own craft, that they were wise to start their migrations in the spring when the water was rising and the ice has broken up, and to avoid against later in the summer as a starting point, since the water level would be lower and slow down travel. Farther west, Horn's Overland Guide and somewhat offered advice for the ideal seasons for overland journeys to the far west. Here, for the first time, the climatic problems associated with extensive travel focus on the aridity of the land and the relative lack of supply of water, something that is noted in the annotations for the route log that accompanies the map. So we see identification of places where potable water would be found and where grass would be found, and warnings about the impassability of roads because of sandy conditions. and then ultimately culminating in the crossing of the Sierra Nevada. A century later, a map for automobile tourists, ironically, perhaps unintentionally or intentionally, positions the story of the Donner Party, the famous Donner Party. And I'm realizing some of the audience will not be familiar with this story that is frequently told to school children in the United States. This is a party of about 81 individuals who attempted to cross the Sierra Nevada into California in the winter of 1845 and 1846. Many people had done so successfully, but they had some bad advice and started too late and were delayed and were ultimately trapped in the Sierra Nevada to spend the winter. And very famously, some in the party had to resort to cannibalism among those that didn't survive in order to survive themselves. Well, here we have a map of the US 40, which follows the same path. A century later, approaching the pass from Reno, Nevada, which juxtaposes the depiction of modern automobiles with Conestoga wagons on the route. At the lower right in this detail, we see a reference to the Donner Party and a small part to the Donner family, which along with a small portion of the party wintered, in 1846-47 in the crude cabins and lean-tos. This is where George Donner, the leader of the party, died. But note, as we continue to cross up the path, how these stories of the travails of the Donner Party are intermixed with exhortations to enjoy the wonderful skiing and water sports that are available, and even fishing that's available in the pass, and it's being developed by this modern infrastructure. And this continues all the way down in the pass. The last scene, here we see a depiction of a party that attempted to escape early in 1847. That's in the top center of this detail. And then something called the Cowards Camp, where a party organized by Lieutenant Woodworth refused to advance further in order to rescue, and was later much criticized for doing so. But again, throughout, we're juxtaposing these changing climatic conditions, the changing views of the climate that are expressed as one passes from migration to tourism, and as the influence of technology of new road building and railroad building takes hold. For switching now to more explicitly looking at productions for tourists, as a phenomenon, climate-based tourism in the United States can be probably traced to the early travel to the northeastern states, to places like Saratoga Springs, hello, Jordana Dim, and adjacent parts of the Northeast, in part to take the waters, but also to escape from what we're seeing as the unhealthful climate and air of busy and often hot cities in the middle of the summer. One of the earliest of these guidebooks by Theodore Dwight talks about Niagara Falls as one of these places. You can see it illustrated at the left. But this is a host of these that describe these various boreal and mountain resorts that were appealing to northern tourists. Another guide by Davison was interesting because at the very beginning of the guide, he made a specific appeal to Southerners, that is, some Southern plantation owners mostly. The oppressive heat of summer in the southern sections of the United States and the consequent exposure to illness, he writes, have long induced the wealthy part of the population to seek, at this season of the year, the more salubrious climate of the North. But the recent gigantic internal improvements of the northern middle states and the development of new and highly interesting natural scenery, together with the increased facilities for traveling, have greatly augmented the number of tourists that are available in the tour, available to tour this area. And so the accompanying map concentrates a great deal in the canals and railroads, small short line railroads that are being constructed in the area, some of which are tourist attractions in their own right. And this is a theme that the attraction of infrastructure that in effect conquers climates will be a theme that we'll close with a little bit later. In Franklin Leavitt's map of the White Mountains, which is in northern New Hampshire in 1859, tourism to the White Mountains was partially conditioned by the embrace of seasonal threats. So in Leavitt's map, he highlights not only the accessibility and luxury of the modern hotels, but he puts in this in context with the notions of several natural disasters that happened caused by people running into bad conditions during the winter months. So we have a Dr. Ball here shown on this detail that was lost in 3 days of snow. And we're seeing a lot of other people that died in this particular area near the summit of Mount Washington, the highest peak in the mountains. The most famous incident was that of the Wiley family, which were killed in an avalanche in 1826. And the Wiley house, which was shown here, became a tourist attraction in its own right because of this way of introducing and somehow making safer the visitation of the terror of winters. In returning to Crowfoot's Transcontinental Guide, which was published shortly after first edition was published in 1869, just as the Union Pacific, Central Pacific Transcontinental route was open. One map in it was calling attention to the changes of elevation that would accompany the journey, which indeed would be part of the interest of the journey itself. He makes much of the construction of snow fences through mountain passes that were also, like other technological developments, attractions for travelers on the railroads themselves. Shifting from winter to the desert, to the south, a little bit later on, the Southern Pacific Railroad, which was completed between California and Western Texas in 1881, advertises the aspects of the desert landscape through which it traveled in this portfolio of chromolithographic views that are, or colorized postcards that are actually not chromoliths, which advertise the unfamiliarity and stark beauty of the desert landscapes, focuses on things like ruins of long gone indigenous towns, which emphasizes both the aridity and survivability and the survival techniques of indigenous people in the region. And also focuses on efforts of the promoters of the railroad to develop dams and the unusual accidental waterway of the Salton Sea, which was created when a dam of the Colorado River accidentally burst and spilled into a depression early in the 20th century, as examples that are set up as standing in stark contrast to the desert environment. And then finally, California, the ultimate destination of a Western trip, is presented as a type of oasis. In the case of Palm Springs to the left, a literal oasis in the case of the cultivation of orange groves and other summertime semi-tropical crops in the San Bernardino Valley are shown as the oasis-like qualities of California as a destination. Modern Florida tourism owes much to the construction of the Florida East Coast Railroad, the brainchild of Henry Flagler, co-founder, who was the co-founder with John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil. In the 1880s, he began investing in the construction of railroads and hotels all along the coast from Jacksonville, all along the east coast of the Atlantic coast of Florida, but from Jacksonville to Miami. The opening of the Panama Canal even encouraged him to extend his railroad all the way to Florida Keys. Along the way, he constructed he promoted what are now familiar images of the South, as of the southeastern, luxurious semi-tropical south of Florida and nearby areas of the Gulf Coast, through the use of palm trees, evocations of swimming destinations, and even the characteristic hotels of the period that he constructed. It was very influential in establishing this Spanish colonial style, which refers to the whitewashed, which emphasizes the whitewashed nature of the construction of hotel infrastructure and other types of architecture historically in semi-tropical and tropical regions. As we move more firmly into the 20th century, the infrastructure itself of the road changes the discourse of a discussion of mobility and the ability to get to different parts of the different climatic regions even more. This very early roadmap published by the state of Ohio in 1932 brags on the back side of it that Iowa has stepped out of the mud by paving its highways, which allows travelers, including farmers themselves and other people traveling to the state, to conquer with the automobile and the paved highway a severe limitation of mobility that was imposed by the seasonal rain and muddy season in Iowa and other parts of the Midwest. And we see through the development of road infrastructure how moving along from Flagler's example, how in this case the Greyhound Bus Company advertises the desirability of traveling to the sunny South from the North seasonally. I'll read this excerpt here. This year, Americans' millions, as well as her millionaires, will be tasting the joys of a reprieve from winter in the sun-drenched Southland. Prohibitive travel costs no longer stand between you and the sun. Greyhound has gave Florida and the fascinating Gulf Coast well within your reach by cutting fares to the lowest level in transportation history. You can trade the frozen fury of Arctic blizzards for the sigh of trade winds, landscapes buried in snow for golf links bathed in sunshine, your overcoat for a coat of tan. And we can see how numerous brochures, and I've got a million of them, that illustrate these kinds of motifs. And the palm tree, which do actually exist naturally in Florida, are very almost unflailingly shown iconically. In contrast, in the desert Southwest, the promotions in the middle of the 20th century also are encouraging people to travel to the sun, to these valleys of the sun, such as Tucson and Arizona. But look in the detail of this map and how the landscapes of the desert, along with the people and the recreational activities, are always intermixed with the cacti and buttes and other aspects of the arid Southwest, being seen here not as a problem for cultivation, but as an amenity for tourists. And I would just call attention to the fact that so many of these maps are using yellow in their color scheme in order to underscore the brightness of the landscape. Yes, making an allusion to the brownish earth tones and tan earth tones of the landscape itself, but it is not seen again as something that's negative. And in this map from 1958, we see the first hints of how in places like California, in fact, the desert landscape is being juxtaposed in the appeals to nearby alpine peaks. Mexico itself also is being done. This is a brochure for Nogales, which stands on the boundary between Sonora State and Mexico and the US state of Arizona, again with these prevailing colors of yellow and bright landscapes in general. In contrast, in the northern Midwest, state governments and tourist agencies turned to a different color scheme, generally blue and green being dominated, to talk about the remnants of previous glaciers, which have created a sportsman's paradise in the forms of lakes and rivers and the boreal forest. Even the use of color schemes to represent parks give you a sense and of national forests, underscore this northern region of Michigan, the state of Michigan, being an area which is lush and green and much to be attractive. The illustrations of tableaus that are often on the backs of these maps, again, underscore these boreal landscapes. And in some cases, fall colors are invoked as another aspect. This guy, if you're wondering who this guy is, straddling this roadway in the map in the middle, this is Paul Bunyan, the mythical gigantic person who felled trees, which became an important iconic symbol of the North Woods. And yet some more examples of the emphasis of lakes and streams as amenities. One of the most famous of these promotions is something called the Minnesota Arrowhead, which is straddles the headwaters of the northern Mississippi and the rivers that will flow, the Great Lakes and the rivers that will flow through Lake Winnipeg, ultimately into the Arctic Sea. We see any number of these similar kinds of scenes. Here is yet another appeal that talks about the Arrowhead as a climatic delight. Comfort and coolness in the summer, crisp embracing airs in autumn, and keen exhilaration in winter mark the seasons in Arrowhead country. Spring comes late and is quickly over, rushing into the midsummer. So one of the interesting things about this is that the North Woods area is that they're embracing both summer recreation and winter recreation, and even, as we've seen, to some extent, fall recreation. In the 1930s, the late 1930s, the state of Michigan even issued 2 editions of its maps each year, one geared to promoting summer recreation, here using the background screen of yellow in order to emphasize the sunshine, and the other one using a blue to promote winter sports, such as skiing and skating. I don't know if there's an image of ice fishing, which is probably the national sport of northern Wisconsin and Michigan. Color does play a part in setting the climatic tone of different areas. So in upstate New York, in the area around the Finger Lakes, here's a brochure which uses red and yellow in order to promote the fall tree visiting season. A map of Mississippi, which is evergreen throughout the year, promotes the greenness of the landscape and its association with water sports. But places like California even have it their own way. We are now looking at a map by Charles Owens, published in 1936 in the height of the Great Depression, which was designed in part to promote tourism in California, was something which was still relatively in its infancy. And I call attention to the fact, as you wander around the details of these maps, you see how California is promoting different climatic aspects of its landscape. So promoting the desert in the Mojave Desert in the far southeast, cheek by jowl with the orange groves and lemon groves that are in the oases in what is called the Inland Empire, northeast of Los Angeles. The great agricultural region of the Central Valley is contrasted to the nearby mountain scenery and glaciers and skiing resorts of the Sierra Nevada. And the great trees, which rely on the lush, humid coastal climates, are yet another thing, another aspect of California tourism, which emphasize to this. But there is an irony in this map, because these are landscapes that are being promoted directly to tourists. On the back of the map, the publishers of the map felt compelled to include this warning. While attractions for tourists are unlimited in California, it is necessary to advise persons seeking employment not to come here at this time. When opportunity arises, California will gladly make it known. The particular context of this is what is called the Dust Bowl, which was a great period of which was a area, if you're not familiar with it, a period of time in the 1930s when a series of droughts left land that was overcultivated, in part because of the stimulus provided by railroad entrepreneurs earlier in the century and in the previous century to settle in places that didn't have adequate natural water supply to sustain agriculture. Many farmers went bankrupt in this time, most famously the Okies from Oklahoma. And if you're familiar with John Steinbeck's book or the movie, The Grapes of Wrath, it tells the story of these Okies that came to California and tried to get agricultural jobs and were met with a hostile reception. Places like Palm Springs are very eager in their brochures to promote the juxtaposition through the means of a cable car, which allows you to play golf in the morning in the sunny valleys near the oasis, and to go skiing in the afternoon, all within a very short change in place and time. And note again the use of blue with the sun to represent the aerial tramway on the brochure cover on the left, and then the yellow being used to promote the desert sun. In some cases, although this is decidedly not in the top tropics, they try to import a bit of Polynesia into the landscape here, the Tropics Hotel. Finally, I want to close on the notion of dams being one example in which the infrastructure that was developed in order to conquer climatic conditions became themselves tourist attractions. The most famous of these is Boulder Dam, now known as Hoover Dam, which was built in the 1930s, provided electricity and water supply that allowed the city of Las Vegas to thrive, shown at the lower left on this map. This is a map that was published by the Union Pacific, which expects to bring tourists to this desert area. And much of the map itself is focusing on the attraction of the works of the dam itself. And it is spectacular if you ever have an opportunity to go to Las Vegas, make a day trip out to Boulder to Hoover Dam to see the spectacular works. And to emphasize the way in which the dam itself is transforming the water economy of Southern California and adjacent parts of Arizona. So the Imperial Valley, which would receive water from the Colorado River and Los Angeles, are shown in this map. And as I mentioned, there's a tremendous interest in how they do this. This is a tourist. The tourist attractions not limited to the most spectacular dams in Montana. Another semi-arid climate was water supplied is provided by the Fort Peck Dam, among many other dams that were built in the middle part of the 20th century to provide a regular and reliable water supply that would make the semi-arid high plains into a cultivatable or at least a grazing paradise. And on the back of the brochure is a little map that also talks about the recreational activities that would be associated with it. The same thing goes along with Grand Coulee Dam that would be allow irrigation in parts of the Columbia River Basin, but was also easily accessible by transportation routes. And much of the brochure talks about how they're working, how the works of the Grand Coulee Dam could be visited and appreciated. Throughout the United States, the reservoirs that were built by countless dams, both in the Tennessee Valley and in the farther west, were ways that brought the Great Lakes and the oceans and the water sports that were found in the North Woods and in the mountain landscapes to areas that didn't have the amenities, such as boating and fishing in calm waters. And one of the famous places where this happened was in the Ozarks of southwest Missouri and northern Arkansas, which is now populated by lakes that are water sport capitals. And profoundly, the Amistad Reservoir, which straddles the boundary between Texas and northern Mexico, is being promoted by the US government as a national park. So I'd like to close. The dams and the water supply are also a potent symbol of the problems climate change is bringing to the American West, indeed elsewhere. The decline during a particularly dry period in the last 20 years has been particularly dramatic, and it had an impact on places like Lake Powell, served by Glen Canyon Dam, are particularly well known and much documented. This is a couple of photographs from Lake Powell in 2017 and the same period 4 years later, which is an historic, in 2020 was an historic low in the water. Literally leaving high and dry marinas that had been formerly built to exploit the interest of the lake as a area bringing water sports to the high desert. Glacier National Park itself is a cause célèbre for climate change in the United States because the very name of the park and its most famous features may disappear by the middle of the century. There may still be mid-snow, a little bit of snow in midsummer, but no permanent glaciers. What then? Will the park have to be rebranded? Will its appeal decline? Will these mountains still be known as the American Alps? The National Park Service reports that all its units are being affected by climate change in some fashion. Yellowstone National Park recently experienced the worst floods it has experienced in perhaps 1,000 years. There are concerns as well that the park's famous hydrothermal features may be fundamentally and aesthetically altered by the declining groundwater levels that exist in the caldera that supply their plumbing. Among other things, the famous Old Faithful geyser may become less faithful. I don't mean to trivialize these issues by any means, but since much of the appeal of these national parks rests on the preservation of a local ecosystem as it was when they were created as national parks, they are, in a sense, the canary in the coal mine, visible evidence, unlike Arctic ice and retreat of permafrost that is well removed from the experience of most Americans. So these canaries in the coal mine make very real for the average American, the touring America, the global effects of climate. This, for me, more than justifies lingering reviews of the way that climate has been promoted historically to tourists and other travelers in the American past. Much of the appeal of ancient ruins throughout the US desert Southwest is the notion that indigenous people of these regions had somehow survived the ebb and flow of climate change. We see this in Wapatki National Park, which the region which climate flourished during a comparatively humid period in the middle part of the last millennium, and Chaco Canyon at the center of a great civilization that disappeared for reasons that are often explained, at least in part, in terms of climate change. And dramatically, Mesa Verde being shown as an ancient civilization that sought refuge in the cliffs under desert landscapes, but continued to practice agriculture in the plateaus above. One wonders how and whether the landscapes of Lake Powell, or a drier or wetter Minnesota Arrowhead, and a snowless or snowier White Mountains will be memorialized for tourists 1,000 years from now. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.